Hey everybody, this is James P. Wagner here at the Dog-Eared Bard's Bookshop. I'm in the back in my offices and I'm here for one of the business book reviews. This is a series that I do just about books having to do with business, not necessarily always business, sometimes personal finance, investing, things like that, but basically that type of stuff because that's a topic that interests me. And, I'm a business owner myself, so I read a lot of books about how to operate and run a business. So I figure considering, have a bookstore now and everybody likes to know recommendations, I would share some books that I've read with you and give my review to them. So the first one I got here for you today is one that some of you may be familiar with. It's actually the number one best-selling personal finance book of all time, and that's Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. Now, this is a book, it's had its fair share of criticism as well as overwhelming amount of praise. People tend to get a little bit offended by the fact that he refers to his biological dad as his poor dad and his best friend's biological dad as his rich dad. He thinks some people say that he's kind of unfair to, employees and the employee mindset or whatever. I don't think that he really necessarily was being insulting to anybody. I think he was just talking about it from his point of view because the book focuses a lot of stories between, his dad who was in education and actually I think superintendent of the area where he grew up in Hawaii, and he had a certain approach to money. And then his rich dad, which was his best friend's father, who owned first a series of small stores and then went on to actually be the biggest real estate owner in all of Hawaii. Apparently, he was the rich dad because he was, he wasn't actually his father, but he was kind of like a second father to him, and he taught him things about money. And he basically, the book explores the different approaches that the two fathers had and kind of where the life of one ended up versus the life of the other. And you could probably guess which one ended up better. But that's just kind of like the focal point of the stories. He talks a lot about his experiences growing up and things like that. A few primary takeaways of this book. You've probably heard by now out there, if you're involved in any kind of business or personal finance, you've heard about the concept of assets versus liabilities. Well, this was the book that kind of really coined the phrase. Maybe it wasn't the first one to talk about it, but it was Robert Kiyosaki himself is definitely the one to really put that concept forward. And, the difference about recognizing assets versus liabilities, basically an asset, something that puts money in your pocket, a liability, something that takes money out of your pocket. Pretty simple, but, one of the things that he talks about that was also pretty controversial because he's big into real estate and investing in it. So he talks about real estate investing as an asset, but he says that your house, even though, through most of the later half of the 20th century, the concept of home ownership, the idea that your house is an asset, he says that that's actually wrong. It's an asset when you're selling the house later on, but while you own the house, it's basically a liability, which, I mean, if you, use common sense, it's kind of true because it's, you're putting money into the house the whole time. You're not getting any money out of the house unless you're doing one of those deals where you're kind of renting part of the house out to somebody else, in which case maybe it's like a hybrid asset liability. But for most people, they just live in the house and it's a liability while you own it because it costs you money. I know for a long time, that was actually one of the major parts of the housing bubble that happened not that long ago because everybody was, getting home loans and owning homes that they may not have necessarily been qualified to actually have. And then boom, we had, what happened with that. Like I said, he shows examples of his poor dad and the approach to money because his dad was actually, his real dad was actually very successful in education, very highly educated. But no matter how many raises he got or promotions he got, somehow there was never any money around. Whereas his rich dad, started off from very humble beginnings. I don't even think he actually graduated high school. And he ended up, pretty much owning businesses in all of Hawaii after, a couple of decades of doing that. He talks a lot about real estate investing. Like I said, that's something that he's very big in. He actually teaches seminars and real estate things on that. There's a little bit of this covered in this book about, but basically just because real estate is one of the prime examples of something that's actually, an asset. If you buy it and then you rent it out to people, you're getting money in. And it talks just about the concept of finding opportunities, hidden opportunities that may be, oblivious to others, but obvious to you. One little story that he talks about that I kind of like because it reminded me a little bit of my own history is the comic book library that him and his best friend actually had. They ended up basically working for it was like either some kind of a gas station or convenience store or something like that back then. But, they had these comic book racks or whatever just filled with comics. And apparently when the person came back to, the comic supplier came back to pick up the stuff that wasn't sold, they would just rip off a piece of the cover to show that they had credit and they would toss the rest of the comic books. So they would basically, in this garbage here, which is like dozens and dozens of comic books that were perfectly good, they just didn't have the barcode anymore. So Robert Kiyosaki and his friend basically asked the supplier, it's like, well, rather than throw them out, can we just, have the comic books? And he said, as long as you don't actually sell them to anybody, you can take them. So they didn't sell them to anybody. What they did was they actually used a room that wasn't being used, I think, in the basement of his friend's house. They cleaned it out and they put it in some shelves, and they basically made a comic book library. And I think on Saturdays for a few hours, they charge kids in the neighborhood, I think, a dime to come in and just read the comics. And I think they even got like one of their sisters to actually sit there and kind of watch it just to make sure everything was okay. And since it cost like a dime to buy a comic book back in those days, for one dime you could sit here and read as many as you could for that time. It was pretty decent business model. It kind of reminded me of when I was younger and my dad had a card store, collectibles generally, so trading cards. And, I would be able to buy entire boxes, for cost just because he was my dad. And, so I'd kind of do that, and I would assemble all these sets together, these cards for the, different things. And then I would sell people the entire sets based on that. Or I'd take some rares or whatever. I mean, I helped him with those in the store, but then I would actually take them to school and kind of do a franchise, or I'd be, selling those or whatever. So it's just little opportunities that are, around here. He kind of talks about that. But yeah, so highly recommended book. Like I said, there's a little bit of controversy about it. Some people say that he's very down on people who aren't business owners or just employees, but I don't really think that's the case exactly. I think he's talking more about the mindset, because you could be an employee and still have, an asset driven mindset. And he talks a lot about that and about acquiring, things that'll put money in your pocket, and hopefully not buying things that will drain money out of your pocket. So, but very highly recommended book. I said it's the #1 best-selling personal finance book of the 20th and I believe the 20th, 21st century, maybe of all time, I think. So check it out, Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki.